Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our June session. So today we have two experts in extremism with us. This was something that we wanted to do even before Buffalo, but that just makes it all the more important right now. Obviously, even when you are covering the most, governmental of government beats, Congress, whatever. I mean, you're going to have to deal with these sorts of issues. So we wanted to make sure that you guys had a good background. We have with us I'm going to let both of you do your own. So we have Bill Braniff, who is the professor at UMD and the director of START, which stands for
National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
And we have Kesa White, who is a research associate at AU at American University, which is also my alma mater. And she is a research associate with PERIL, which stands for
the Polarization, Extremism, and Research Innovation Lab. It's
Yes.
a lot one.
And so Kesa is particularly an expert in white supremacy. Bill was a consultant for the White House in 2015 on extremism, but also has a history of, he was a director of the Counterterrorism Center at West Point. So they both have a lot of knowledge to share with us today. So I'm going to let them kick it off, and let's give them a round of applause.
That's fine. So my name is Kesa White. I'm currently a primary researcher, I guess you could call me. I go into all the dark, scary places that nobody else wants to go, and I see what those conversations are between far-right violent extremists, white supremacists, nationalists, and just people that are wanting to troll and dox people online. So a lot of the time, I will go onto those platforms and kind of see like what they're talking about, whether it's Telegram, 4chan, Facebook, and every other place. And then a lot of the times I will archive that information, whether it's on a spreadsheet, give it to someone else, or provide it to a deliverable on a project. Right now at PERIL, we're doing different projects, whatever it may be, on education, the Great Replacement. I'm sure we're all experts on that pretty much at this point because it's all we've heard about, and reading a lot of manifestos. So currently, right now, my job is going onto these platforms and pretty much just monitoring what they're saying. And then I'll do maybe a report on that or whatever it may be. It's a pretty interesting job. It's not for everybody because you are going into these dark spaces and it can be very emotionally tolling. So it's really important to take care of your mental health in this field, and sometimes just knowing when to unplug. For example, over the weekend I did unplug, and there were a couple mass shootings over the weekend, so I chose the wrong weekend to unplug. So yeah, that's pretty much like what I do. I read all of the manifestos for all the violent extremists that we've had and everything like that. And yeah, I'm not sure what else you want me to cover.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Thank you. So I'm Bill Braniff. I'm the director of START at the University of Maryland. I was an Army officer. I worked in nuclear counterterrorism at the National Nuclear Security Administration, and then went back up to West Point and was the director of practitioner education there. So my job was to take the research that we were doing at the CTC, which was largely based on primary sources captured in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. All of that information, if there was a laptop, a thumb drive, pocket litter that came off of somebody on an objective in a combat zone, it all wound up in a database called the Harmony database. And we would mine that database to look for information that we could then use to publish unclassified open source research on. And my job was to take that research and bring it to places like the FBI, CIA, Joint Special Operations University, state and local law enforcement as a trainer. So I spent a lot of time with the interagency in a training environment. I've been at START at the University of Maryland for the last 10 years, and I'm not an expert on a sort of a specific topic. I'm much more of a generalist. but really I run the organization, so I don't spend as much time as I would like to in the substance. Of note for our conversation today, one of the things that START is well known for, we maintain large data sets on this very politicized and emotive topic, right? This is a kind of topic that it's intended to get you to react emotionally. It's intended to make people overreact. And so one antidote to that is to provide longitudinal data that not normalizes this topic in any way, but that allows us to allocate resources to make decisions based on a large set of data instead of our knee-jerk reactions to an emotive event that happened in the days or weeks prior. So that includes the Global Terrorism Database, which is the largest unclassified database in the world on terrorist attacks. To over 200,000 attacks dating back to 1970. We have the two largest data sets on individual level perpetrators in the United States of terrorism on one hand and hate crime on the other. One thing I would ask you to think about is in your career is not to give hate crime sort of a second tier status. There's something in our collective psyche where we think terrorism is really bad and hate crime is bad but not as bad. And that's obviously not right. In a bad year of terrorism in the United States, there are 60 to 70 terrorist attacks. In a given year in the United States, there are 9,000 hate crimes, and that's a conservative number. And yet we don't give the victims of hate crime the same level of attention, and it's really a problem. So I would just encourage you to think about terrorism and hate crime as a ideologically motivated crime, kind of a collective. Because what happens is we don't allocate resources to deal with hate crime like we allocate resources at the government level to deal with terrorism. And that creates all sorts of negative second order consequences. But anyway, those two data sets are fairly unique. There's about 2,200 individuals in our terrorism perpetrator data set and about 1,000 in our hate crime data set. And that allows us to actually apply theory and methods to study things like radicalization or mobilization of violence. Right? There's a lot of people who have opinions about how people get to the point of engaging in a violent crime. We can actually test those theories with large data sets, and that allows us to speak to the U.S. government, I think, with a degree of credibility that's useful. We're a nonpartisan organization. We don't take sides. We try to inform policy and practice with the best data and analysis that we can. And I think that's a really important role, given, again, how politicized and emotive the topic is. I'll stop there.
Just because you have collected data for so long, how have you seen these movements change? Like, have you seen patterns or changes in the flow?
Sure. So if you look at terrorism in the United States, lone actors now comprise over 50% of the perpetrator population, meaning that for every attack that might have 3 perpetrators involved, there are 3 or more lone actor attacks, right? So it's in terms of number of attacks, it's even more than a 50-50, sort of split. It's a lot more lone actors now, and that there's some, I think, kind of misconceptions about what that means for law enforcement. Common wisdom would suggest, and it's true, that it's harder for the law enforcement community to detect a lone actor plot because there's no plotting, there's no meetings, and there's no communication, but necessarily between offenders, things that law enforcement might be able to pick up on. But that does not translate into more effective plotting, meaning lone actors are actually not more successful than group offenders. There's just so many more of them that, of course, they do sometimes succeed in their violent plots. So lone actors is a big topic, and Kesa's work about online radicalization and mobilization of violence would explain that phenomenon, I think, quite well. Meaning you don't need a community of in-person collaborators to have a community that spurs you on to violence. That is very much present online. There's, a surprise to no one, terrorist attacks involving firearms. They're about 30% of the attacks in the United States, so they're responsible for over 80% of the fatalities. The most lethal attacks involve firearms. The most frequent weapon choice is actually incendiary devices, which is something that doesn't make the news. People don't really think about that, but that is the most frequent weapon of choice, incendiary attacks. There's lots to talk about. In terms of hate crime, the African American population makes up the largest victim population of hate crime in the United States. The LGBTQ community is, I think, the second, which is a surprise to many. But gender identity and gender violence is incredibly prolific in the United States, including among hate crime offenders. The anti-Semitic violence, it sort of sits on both sides of the spectrum. There's a lot of non-violent hate crime against Jewish symbolic targets. So things like a swastika tagged on a temple. But they also, the Jewish population is also the victim of the largest number of mass casualty hate crimes, right? So they sort of sit on the spectrum of non-violent and incredibly violent attacks. Starting in 2015, 2016, we saw a 3 to 4-fold increase in the Latinx victimology. And this is right during the primary season in which we started to hear political rhetoric about invasion and invaders from South America and Central America. And we saw a 4-fold increase in the number of hate crimes targeting the Latina population. There is an inextricable link between political violence and politics, right? These things are, we'd like to pretend like they're somehow not related, they're related. And maybe last thing I'll say is, with 6 January, obviously a huge amount of attention given to 6 January. One of the subpopulations among 6 January were veterans, right? 16% of the individuals arrested for the insurrection on 6 January have a military service background, compared with 9% of the population at large. So much more than represented in that sample. I'm a veteran, and so I'm part of a group that co-founded a new veterans organization called We the Veterans, and our mission statement is to build on the strengths of the veteran and military family community to crowd out vulnerabilities to things like misdis, malinformation, and violent extremism. Why am I saying this? There's this idea that somehow the federal government or the law enforcement community is best placed to address terrorism, and of course that's not accurate, right? Most warning signs of somebody mobilizing to violence are sort of intimate warning signs. We don't really want the government to have access to that kind of insight into our individual lives, right? But family and friends are much more likely to see concerning behaviors or warning signs and be able to interdict. So as we looked at the 6 January numbers regarding veterans, as a veteran and with my fellow veterans, we said, the community that's best placed to address this is the veteran community itself and the families, right? And so we're trying to take this issue on, which is, of course, incredibly politicized, right? It's not an easy space to operate in because you become a lightning rod even if you don't want to be. So we try to keep a pretty sober tone as we talk about these issues.
Yeah, I can hop in on that topic. Let's see where to start. We are seeing a lot of trends pretty much over time, because if you look at it, the Klan started with just handing out flyers and having in-person meetings, like something like this. And now we can go online, whether it's on your computer, your phone, your iPad, wherever it may be, and you can talk to someone across the world, across the country, wherever it may be, and you guys can become friends. And then from friends, they can reel you in just by doing little things and seeing where you have interests, commonalities. And then from there, they'll say, hey, let's go to an encrypted platform, which is Telegram, Signal, or wherever it may be. And then you're now talking to them on an encrypted network where nobody else is able to see your communication and interfere with that. And then from there, it's like, okay, hey, this person is pretty cool. They're gonna be a good ideological person to radicalize, or just someone good for our movement. And then they bring you in to meet their friends. And then from there, it's just a spiral effect of just becoming ideologically radicalized and just becoming involved in their network and movement. So just because we are seeing a decrease in organizations right now, which you can see a lot of the data from START, the ADL, and SPLC, we are seeing an increase in lone actors, which is very scary because we aren't able to pretty much predict whatever that factor may be whenever they're going to target someone, if they're going to target a person, a group, a memorial, whatever it may be, which makes it really hard, especially for me to like do my job. So it's pretty much just finding a needle in a haystack, because you're having to go through all of these platforms, all of these chats to pretty much just see who is saying something alarming, who is saying something that we should be looking into. Should I be alerting the authorities? Is it not to the point where I should be alerting the authorities, but just looking into this person a little bit more? In addition to PERIL, I wear a bunch of different hats. I'm a fellow at a bunch of different places. I write. And another place that a lot of people aren't necessarily looking at right now is extremism in gaming, which is a really big thing right now, even before Buffalo, which people fail to recognize. Because on these online gaming communities, whether you're on Discord, Twitch, or Steam, you're able to interact with people, whether it's a first-person shooter game, and play against each other, or even if you're chatting with one another in like the online chat, I'm able to put like swastikas or anything, for example, because say instead of just copying and pasting like a normal looking swastika with like lines, I'll make it with periods and semicolons and everything like that. So content moderation won't pick that up, because to them it just looks like periods and semicolons. So that's something that I think that we definitely need to look more into, because it is another pathway for radicalization. Because radicalization doesn't just go from A to B. Someone can go from A to C, and then they can go back from C to A. So it rests on a spectrum, and it doesn't go just back and forth, because you never know when that person may just wake up one day and say, hey, I'm ready to do X, Y, Z, which is why it's really important to look out for the signs and indicators, which family and friends are very able to notice a lot of the time, which we have at PERIL, we have the SPLC Parents and Caregivers Guide, which pretty much just lists all the indicators and things that we should be looking for, because there always is a point in time where someone could have stopped that attack, because it does rest on a spectrum. And there always is that intervention point where we can go in and pretty much intercept, which you can see like in their manifestos. You can see how they were radicalized. You can see what the ticking point was. For example, with Buffalo, because I did read all 800 of those pages, unfortunately, and the manifesto, he talks about his pathway to violence, how he pretty much just woke up one day, and after he saw the attack in Christchurch, that was pretty much his point, which is why it's really important not to share these manifestos, these videos, because essentially we're just giving them ammo to radicalize themselves. Even a lot of the time when I'm on certain encrypted platforms, I'll see a lot of media articles, which is really scary, because it's like we are trying to do our job, and it'll be the title that's problematic, which they will use as ammo. Especially we saw it with the Great Replacement. A lot of the titles were pretty much just saying, hey, we do have a problem. We are going extinct. This is why we need to do something, because this reporter said X, Y, Z. So we just have to be very careful not to give them ammo to further radicalize themselves, to radicalize one another, or whatever it may be, because we are pretty much aiding them however they can see fit, which is a really scary thing, because we are just trying to do our jobs.
Yeah. If I may just build on that. So think about the so-called Islamic State. This is an organization that is, was famous for its slick propaganda, right? It's incredibly high production value propaganda. Our colleague Audrey Alexander, when she was at George Washington's program on extremism, she looked at, I think it was Twitter, Islamic State Twitter accounts. And I think over 60% of the URLs that were shared by Islamic State supporters in the United States weren't this high production value terrorist propaganda. It was mainstream media. 60% of their content that they shared online to recruit and radicalize and mobilize others to violence was just retweeting mainstream media. right? It gave them the ammunition that they needed. So maybe not you, but talk to your producers. There's a really important role for journalism in not throwing gasoline on the fire, but producers have an incentive to create that catchy headline, and it's a problem, right? It's a problem.
Can you talk more about that, about the types of articles that you see reshared? I mean, is it like, 2020 census finds, like those sorts of things, or?
Oh, no, it's not like that at all. I've seen, let's see, CNN articles, USA Today, Politico, different types of articles, just pretty much just floating around. They'll say like, oh, look at what this reporter said about us today. And even last week, I did an article with USA Today, and it was actually one that I was quoted in from another reporter, and it was on sainthood, and it was in the sainthood channel. So they were pretty much just saying, oh, like they're in our networks, they know what we're doing, and we're going to drop it right here. And I saw that one article in multiple different platforms, channels, and everything, which is scary, because unfortunately I have been doxxed before when I was an undergrad at American University, which actually got me into this field because of the banana incident at American University. Taylor Dumpson was my sorority sister and roommate, so that was a very frightening night, because we lived together, and just because she wanted to be the first African American female president at AU, I was pretty much collateral damage, and they were threatening to like come knock on our door. They wanted to do all this crazy, really bad stuff to us, and they put our phone numbers online, our social media, and everything. And it was a very scary situation, and that can happen to pretty much any of us. I've even seen other researchers, their information on platforms, and then obviously, of course, like I go and warn them. And then you also see like reporters and media individuals, their information online. So we are all targets of doxing, which is why it's really important to secure everything, make sure all of your profiles and everything are locked down, because we are susceptible to being doxed.
You talked about politics and violence are intrinsically related, right? And we're talking about hate crimes and terrorism. But I'm curious about how we're seeing it go the other way, from some of the more radical things that we're seeing on the platforms getting into our political language. Can you go into more detail about that and how our politics may be being shaped by some of the more kind of self-critical placement and stuff that's going on in the conversations before today?
I can start. If you think about the evolution of white supremacy in the United States, there was a movement away from superficial trappings like white hoods or red suspenders and jackboots. This idea of the clean Klan started a trajectory where white supremacists were trying to come across as more innocuous, and it manifested more recently in the alt-right. So the alt-right is this idea that if we can change culture, the politics will follow. But we have to operate at a cultural level in order to shift the goalposts, move the Overton window to a point where all of a sudden certain policies will become more tolerable to the public. And so there was this intentional move to sort of go below the radar, to use humor, to dress nicely and integrate with journalists as well as a political party in order to start to change American culture. That's called metapolitics, but it's just a fancy word for trying to create an environment in which really horrendous policies would be seen as more tolerable. So it's not an accident. Like what you're describing is an intentional strategy. Mis and disinformation amplifies that, or makes that sort of accelerates that process, right? Because you have hostile foreign influence operators who are looking at any vulnerability in our system and trying to exploit that 24/7, 365 days a year, right? It's a constant attack to try to take a strong opinion somewhere and amplify that to polarize the United States. And so unfortunately what's happened is we have domestic extremism, right? You have hostile foreign influence operators exacerbating that, and then you have a commercial, a business model which entirely accepts or amplifies this, right? So 24-hour cable news. Think about that. Like, no one wants to watch the news 24 hours a day, 7 days, right? Like, that's insane, because, right? So they don't sell. It's not the news, right? It's entertainment. And what exactly are they? How are they entertaining people? How are they? What is the mechanism? A lot of people say that they sell fear. I don't think that's right. I think they sell righteous anger, right? They sell righteous anger. You get your dopamine hit every time you turn on a cable news channel and you say, yeah, those people over there, right? It's this polarizing environment, and it's got a bottom line that is driving it. So there's no real accountability. It's not news. It's news entertainment, and as a result, we launder our cable news and then and social media, our own population, but on literally our news channels launder Russian disinformation and domestic extremist ideas and put it into the mainstream.
Yeah. I'll go really quickly going off of that point. Pretty much, even with like the Great Replacement, for example, how that was going around, that was popularized in 2011 by an essay. So it isn't a new phenomenon. That is something that we have seen over time, but even before Buffalo, it was mainstream. So even though maybe like a lot of people hadn't heard of it because they aren't in those different communities, or even maybe depending on their news network, it was something that we were hearing about from politicians. And even if they weren't specifically saying it explicitly, Great Replacement, they were saying the definition of it. And it's just something that we have to have a good ear for, because a lot of the times they won't say they won't say the words, but they'll provide the definition. And if it's not them providing the definition, it's one of their followers or somebody like that who has that ear and that's willing to say it. So then from what their follower is saying, and then what that politician, whoever it may be, is saying, you can connect the dots and see, okay, this is what they are talking about. They are trying to mainstream this topic. So they aren't new things that we are seeing. And it's just that we're talking about them right this second. But then by next week, it'll be something new. We're not talking about it anymore. But then after it comes up again, it's just pretty much like a cycle.
Hi, I'm Candace. I work for the 19th Gender and Politics. I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the policy approaches that you've seen to handling like hate crimes in particular. I don't know a lot about it, but I feel like I hear a lot about like law enforcement, and like you've already said, like that's not necessarily the best approach. Particularly, I think about like marginalized communities and the relationships there between law enforcement. So I guess I'm wondering if you could, one, talk about like the policy approaches that you've seen, and then what recommendations you hear people wanting to see more of.
Sure. So 9/11 casts a very long shadow, right? It is the most anomalous terrorist attack in human history. It is an anomaly. There's nothing like it historically, and yet we really created our counterterrorism architecture based on 9/11. So we invested a tremendous amount of resources at the federal level to deal with international terrorism. Hate crime is the opposite story. Well, I shouldn't say that. If we back up, the Department of Justice was created literally in response to the KKK, a federal government entity, because local law enforcement was either complicit in the crimes of the KKK or just not willing to hold individuals accountable. So a federal government entity was created in order to try to create a response, a policy response, but it was a law enforcement or a criminal justice response. However, over time, hate crime really got relegated down to the state and local level. So the federal government really doesn't have a massive presence in terms of addressing hate crime. If you think about the FBI, for example, the FBI has a criminal division and a counterterrorism division. And the counterterrorism division does terrorism, and the criminal division does hate crime. They have a task force where they try to sort of share information, but that's a massive discrepancy in amount of sort of resources and attention, right? That's being given. Just as one example, But really, hate crime tends to get relegated to state and local levels. There is a data set called the Uniform Crime Report. The FBI maintains this, but it is up to local jurisdictions to report data into the UCR. And there's a massive underreporting of hate crimes. Most jurisdictions don't report any. So we don't have good data on the number of hate crimes in the United States. If you don't have good data, you can't allocate resources effectively. Again, 60 to 70 terrorist attacks in a given year, 9,000 hate crimes, according to UCR, which we know is a wildly low number. But think about the amount of resources that we, give to terrorism versus hate crime. It's kind of mind-numbing. So it often becomes a state or local issue. And you're correct that many of the populations that are targeted by hate crimes don't enjoy a trust-based relationship with the law enforcement community. So they're reluctant to report those crimes as a general rule, which means law enforcement is really not well situated to deal with this. Furthermore, because of the freedom of speech and freedom of association, you can say hateful things in a gathering of people, and it is constitutionally protected, including things, talking about violence, right? Unless it's an imminent and likely threat regarding a specific target, an individual or a location, it's protected speech. So the law enforcement community is left to respond after something bad happens, by and large, instead of do something, to interdict. This is not unique to to hate crime. Over 60%, think about this for a second, over 60% of the violent terrorist plots in the United States, domestic terrorism plots, succeed in killing or injuring somebody. It's over a 60% success rate for violent domestic terrorist plots. Our law enforcement community doesn't have the tools to interdict in most cases because it's legal to buy a weapon, it's legal to have a driver's license, it's legal to say hateful things, it's legal to be in a dark web forum saying horrible things, and then one day going out and doing it is very hard to stop. So we have a 60% plus success rate for domestic terrorist plots. It's probably higher for hate crime. Hate crime is also often spontaneous, not premeditated, which makes it even harder to do anything other than respond after the fact. And then there's also often mixed motives. A lot of hate crime involves sort of targeting somebody, a vulnerable person, and you target them because of their identity, but you also steal their wallet. So there's also a mixed motive thing that goes on with hate crime, which can sort of obfuscate what's actually happening and why. So that's that's not much of a policy response, because I don't know that there is much of a policy response, right? I think it sort of is left to we'll just let the law enforcement community handle it, but that clearly is not an adequate response. In the terrorism field, we've moved from a law enforcement perspective to much more of a public health approach to violence prevention. And the good news there is that if we're serious about that as a nation, that will have positive second-order effects on things like hate crime, right? Because a primary prevention, a secondary prevention approach, these are agnostic as to, right? They can have a positive impact preventing someone from going down that road that might wind up in either a terrorist attack or a hate crime, because those are such close cousins. So a public health approach is sort of the approach that, for example, the Department of Homeland Security is now taking. They have a large grant program that they're funding, public health approaches to violence prevention in the extremist space. And we're seeing, I was just with Kesa's colleague up in New York State. They're setting up the New York State Homeland Security and Emergency Management Organization is setting up a new domestic terrorism office. And we were encouraging them to also adopt a public health approach, right? So that's sort of the current state of affairs. Sorry, that was long-winded.
Going off of the policy standpoint, now that I'm thinking about it really quick, in terms of hate crimes, if you look at the James Byrd Act for hate crimes and how we have now the Anti-Lynching Act that was passed this year, those are two things you can look at. But a lot of things that I look at particularly are like content moderation and things like online. So Section 230 protects a lot of the social media platforms from being held liable, which does make it very hard to then go after these platforms, because just because the Buffalo shooter may have said XYZ online, 4chan is not held liable, but also because 4chan doesn't want a seat at the table and doesn't want to acknowledge they have a problem, even though we have seen a lot of attacks coming from that platform. They're not going to sit down with people like GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, to talk about these issues and acknowledge they have a problem. I'm pretty sure that all these social media platforms are probably tired of me bashing them about content moderation. But even after I wrote an article on TikTok, now TikTok changed their policies a little bit. So it does make it harder for me to do my job a little bit, but then it's also helping protect children that are on TikTok, for example.
Hi, my name is Jimena Bustillo. I actually have a couple of questions, so just like bear with me. This is something I'm like really interested in like not like a horrifying way. I guess like the first question that I have is, I know there was a like kind of like trend in style, like for how we were discussing shooters or like anyone that commits an act of violence, like a national sexual assault case or a mass shooting, where we like journalists were instructed to not necessarily name or discuss or focus on the shooter or the perpetrator. And with the last two incidents in Buffalo and in Texas, I kind of noticed a little bit more of a focus on like who the shooter was, what their motivations were, what their, even like family history may have been. And so I'm wondering, like, in terms of like for us who are journalists, we're reporters, we're asked to write these stories sometimes like really quickly, like how much do you think that there is value in not calling out, but maybe going into an explanation or a history of like, if someone did write a manifesto, like, is that something important for the public to know, versus like what crosses the line of like talking too much about it and spending too much time on it, and then our articles end up on 4chan. Like, what is kind of that line, especially when you say, hate crimes, should have a higher tier in coverage, which to me is an indication that they should have a high tier of coverage if you're saying that. So like, how should we navigate that as journalists?
It's a great question, and it's not an easy one. There's not an obvious answer. I think that the best practice is to provide, sort of the minimum information that the public needs to understand what happened, which is important in a free and open society, but not to turn the perpetrator into an 800-pound gorilla, into something that could be lionized by others, and focus more on the victims. And then the sort of what can we learn from the incident, I think is important, right? The journalist community has a really important role in educating us all about how to improve in terms of policy, practice, so there is an important role there, but just not highlighting the person, the perpetrator, to too great of an extent, I think is important. Kesa said it earlier, that the Buffalo shooter, like, he saw the Christchurch massacre and said, I want to do that, right? Like the sharing manifestos and these sorts of things is really dangerous. It's really, really dangerous. So no video, no photos of the act that re-traumatizes the victims and their families, and no sharing of manifestos and these sorts of things.
Yeah, I actually knew this question was going to come up, so I wrote some notes on it. Let's see what I wrote. I think it's really important to build like connections with researchers, like people like us, because we can provide you with that information that isn't going to be politicizing it, and also like glorifying it. And then also, I know a lot of the times we want to be like the first person to like report on something like breaking news, but that can also backfire, because if it's not the right information, you're contributing to mis and disinformation. And then that will then just become like a spiraling effect, and then can be used as ammo, as I mentioned previously. So it's just really important not to glorify whoever the perpetrator may be. And then even like in the Buffalo shooter's manifesto, he wanted you all to be saying his name and talking about what he did. He wanted to do what he was doing for clout necessarily. He knew that the media had an issue with guns. So the more that we talk about these different issues, we are giving them what they wanted. He wanted that clout. He wanted to be talked about and to not be necessarily forgotten. So it is really important that we do focus on the victims, but then also at the same time not paint the perpetrator as a monster, because then it makes it gives them also what they want, but then we also don't want to make them be almost like a teddy bear, like, oh, he did nothing wrong, things like that. So we have to find the perfect medium, because you also don't want to say, oh, they were on 4chan. Now somebody's going to go, oh, like, what's 4chan? And I'm going to go on 4chan just because I don't know what it is. And I'm going to go to, the gun board, the K board, or the poll board, politically incorrect board, and just see what they're talking about. And if I find community with these people, I'm going to keep hanging out with them. So it's just really important that even just saying 4chan like over and over again, we just be careful with that and just say, oh, the perpetrator was on a forum or a board or a platform, because you always do have that one person who is very interested and is willing to go on those platforms just to see what it is.
Yeah, like, so kind of like a two-parter off of that, like, do you have any data on like entry points to those platforms? Like, is there any way like feasibly to kind of collect that? And kind of off of that, like, I could also see the argument that it would be important for journalists to say, like, this is a platform that is used for this reason, or like this person just like had a manifesto and did believe these things. But I can also see how that could get other people thinking about that, but it also reminds other people that those things are real and they are dangerous. So do you have like an article or like any good example of when that perfect like straight line medium was followed?
Let me think for a second.
While you're thinking, I think that it depends on, in some ways, like your beat, right? So what periodical are you writing for? Who's the readership? If it's a general population, then maybe you can be lighter on the specifics. If you're writing for like the tech beat, then going into more detail about Silicon Valley and which platforms are doing a better job in content moderation makes a lot of sense, right? Because that's where someone who's a professional who's in that field is going to go to get their information, and might actually improve policy and practice. So that's one way to think about it, is based on the readership. But democracies are vulnerable to this kind of tactic because we have a free press, and a free press is important to our democracy. And so, it is a very difficult place. And I don't think that there's a perfect answer out there, to be honest.
In terms of an article, that's what I was thinking of. I have it saved in my Apple News, so I will give it to you at the end of this. Because as I was reading it, I realized that it was the perfect medium between saying what one of the victims was feeling and saying how she was feeling being in the supermarket and everything like that, but then also talking about this is what happened, while the reporter or the author didn't necessarily say the perpetrator's name. So it was the perfect medium by talking about the attack, but then also talking about what the victim was feeling at the same time. And I don't remember the other part of your question, but I know that I had an answer.
It was like, do you have any kind of data on like entry points? Like, can you actually pinpoint like, reading this in news is actually what leads people to discover 4chan? Or yes. Like, is it like inner groups? Because inner groups will like spread and have like those conversations with each other, and that's the bigger entry point. Like, what does that data look like, if that's even possible to track?
It is possible to track, because that's what pretty much like what I do, like following trends, and like seeing how they hop from platform to platform, and seeing how their rhetoric and their radicalization necessarily changes, because seeing how someone will talk on Twitter, for example, is different how they may talk on Gab, and then on Stormfront. So it's different ways that they will talk about these issues. But in terms of data, I'm not necessarily sure, but I know for like myself, because I do primary research, I do have archived information of seeing how someone will go across platforms by following them. But another way that I can also notice it is because of the rhetoric they will use, because most of the time it'll go from Twitter. Someone will go from Twitter to Reddit, and then from Reddit to 4chan. So you can see the way someone talks on, I can recognize someone that's new to 4chan just because the lingo and rhetoric they will use are things that you would say on Reddit. So even the posters on 4chan can recognize, oh, you must be new, you're from Reddit, because of things that you're saying. So it's really interesting just to see how we can recognize that. It's just one of those things you have to have an eye for. That's why it's really important to become like almost like best friends with like a researcher, so we can necessarily just give you this information. Like I have a few reporters that I guess I'll say like we're besties. So I'll say, hey, did you look at this? And they're like, oh no. And I'm like, you should look into that. So I'm essentially, I don't know, like just pitching you like an idea. And then I'll say, okay, here's like information and data to like back this up. And here's, I don't know, a screenshot, an archived link to like back up what I'm saying. So pretty much you're ahead of the curve, because this is what we're going to be talking about soon, or here's something that you should watch that we're not seeing right now, but keep it like in the back of your mind. So it's really important to become like besties with with researchers.
Hey, my name is Matt. I'm a reporter with the Washington Post. Lots of questions in my brain, but just focusing on one about how, I guess, staying on how we report on these questions. One thing that's been occurring to me is just that, like Christchurch, Charleston, Dayton, El Paso, Buffalo, all of these are going to be world historical events that are eventually going to be in textbooks. And we're eventually going to want like a full historical account of actually how they went down. And it sounds, and that part of that is, preserving primary documents, having the secondary documents of what the news reports are like. And I'm curious what y'all's perspective is on not just publishing with care and setting aside like maybe bad faith actors in mainstream and or other media outlets who might be laundering other ideas, but how do you think about when you said like for instance like don't share like video, don't share original posts, like don't share the person's name and glorify them, which are all things that I think exploit, as you all have said, like the media's sensibility that like all the news that's fit to print and all that stuff. How do you all balance that versus the fact that eventually we are going to know what actually happened ultimately, and not just the responsibility of the media in like collecting this information or collecting the traumatic stories of victims and stuff and collecting the actual manifesto of the killer, but also then how do you balance that not just with what our responsibility is as a journalist, but then also you guys talk a lot about the tech platforms and the fact that like I think that I think it was like it wasn't Periscope, it was a Twitch, Periscope, Discord. Which one was you live streaming on first? Twitch, yeah, for like 30 seconds or something before they took it down. Like, what's the responsibility of different tech platforms? And like, if you post a manifesto on Google Docs, like, what's their responsibility? Like in the moment to law enforcement, to the public, to history. Like how do you balance that? Because yeah,
it's a great question. So I mentioned the Global Terrorism Database in my little spiel at the beginning. We look at 2 million news articles a day from around the world. We use artificial intelligence to whittle that down to about 30,000 articles a month, and then we read those articles. Those are the articles that are relevant to terrorist attacks. So quite literally, the most comprehensive data set in the world on terrorism is based on open source media reporting from journalists. It's a huge resource. The US government uses it. I mean, this is one of the most important resources in all of sort of counterterrorism, because it's how governments allocate resources. They look at our data, and it's all based on journalism, right? So it's really important. That documentary role that you mentioned is really important. So, we're not saying that shouldn't happen, right? That has to happen. It has to happen for things like war crimes. It has to happen for things like, what happened with the Islamic State, right? I mean, the role that journalists play is so important, but it has this downside, right? And we just have to be cognizant of that. In terms of the second or the last part of your question, because I don't know how to answer the middle of it, the role of tech platforms. Yeah, so Kesa mentioned the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, the GIFCT. This is an industry body. It was created by Google, YouTube, Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook. So 4 large companies sort of created this industry body to try to self-police. And the idea is that there's so many tech platforms that are tiny, right? There's 2 people living in someone's basement, and they have a tech company, right? They don't have a counterterrorism team. They don't have a policy team. It's a couple people, right? So the GIFCT, the idea was, could we benefit from the amount of revenue that a company like Facebook has, and then share best practices down to the smaller companies that don't have the same resources. I'm on the independent advisory committee for the GIFCT, so I should say that. I have real mixed feelings about my role and the GIFCT itself. I sometimes wonder if I'm a what's the tobacco company? Philip Morris. If I'm a Philip Morris scientist, do you know what I mean? Like, am I a Philip Morris scientist? Am I providing a smoke screen of the industry is doing, they're self-policing. Look, they've got the GIFCT and they've got an independent advisory committee. They must be really tackling this issue. And I really struggle with it because, to be honest, the people that I talk to at the big tech companies are incredible. They're brilliant. They're dedicated. They care terribly about this issue. But they're not the business managers. They're not the engineers. They're not the board, right? Are they a smokescreen for an industry that is, right? And so it's a real challenge. But having said that, so the GIFCT maintains something called the Content Incident Protocol, the SIP. And when there is a live stream act of violence, they initiate the SIP. They've only initiated it, I think, twice. Mm-hmm. Buffalo was the second time. So that clip was downloaded something like 130 times. Or no, sorry, I forget the numbers. Very quickly, they initiated the SIP, but there was enough people who had been present to download that video that it still got out. The idea that the industry that is designed to share information as quickly as possible in as many different formats as possible is going to be able to stop information from being shared, it's unlikely, right? So even when a well-meaning body very quickly initiates a very well-intentioned protocol, it's only doing damage control. And many of the companies, like Kesa mentioned, they have no interest in being a part of a member company of the GIFCT. They don't volunteer themselves because they don't have the resources, or they care more about free speech and information, sort of a free and open internet than they want to lean into any sort of censorship, which is ultimately what it comes down to, right? And so there's a lot of companies that just don't play ball.
Just really, really quick following up on like the other side of what I was saying. Just for instance, in the immediate aftermath of Buffalo, a lot of people were talking about the Great Replacement Theory and how this is a thing, and we had like the Great Replacement Theory explained, and then a lot of like shots were shot at, quite frankly, like right-wing media and Fox News about, you guys have been laundering this and stuff. Is that empirically true in y'all's understanding, like that certain media outlets have actually perpetuated this stuff into the bloodstream? Because you mentioned outlets that are people consider like mainstream when you said USA Today, Politico. Those are the things that are getting shared in these channels. So is it sensationalism? Is it an active editorial slant? What is, like, when you see people in these spaces being radicalized and or citing like media coverage, like what are the types of outlets? Is both? Like what is the most damaging side of the media in this?
Both. Whether it be it doesn't just have to be like the mainstream like media outlets. It can be like a little county newspaper. I'm from New Jersey, so we have Burlington County newspaper. Someone in New York isn't going to care about little small town issues, but if there's somebody out there and they say, oh well, this outlet said their Great Replacement is going to happen by 2023, they're going to put that in that platform, channel, whatever it may be. So there isn't just one media outlet to necessarily say they're at fault, even though there are some that are at fault. But it's very hard to say, because there are certain media outlets that some people turn to more than others. But yeah, there isn't just necessarily one. It's just a mix. And even though we did have all of these explainers out there, a lot of them were right, a lot of them were wrong. But I think that it was just information overload at the same time, because we were getting it from so many different directions, so many different people, and then depending on what your media outlet is, took like different stances on it. So it's pretty much just, it's just a melting pot. So it's just whoever is feeling angry that day, they're just going to go out and go on a hunt and say, this is a problem, I'm going to put this in on Telegram, on 4chan, whatever, and I'm just going to keep digging to see, like, until I can find like more information on this, and they're going to share it with their buddies on Facebook, and then it's just pretty much everywhere. And then now everyone is getting radicalized, like I mentioned, because you don't just go from A to B, you can go from A to D, you can go from D to A, you can go back and forth, and it doesn't just take like a certain number of like months or weeks or however it may be, but some people it takes longer than others, because like the Buffalo shooter, for example, he had said Christchurch when he was like 15 or 16 is what was like his trigger point. So that was how many years ago? And then here we are today. So it just varies by person. And then for Texas, for example, still just trying to figure out answers. Like even while I was on his Instagram, for example, because what I like to call the amazing race is trying to find the perpetrators' social media platforms before they're taken down. Even while I was on his Instagram, when I went to like refresh the page, it was all gone. So luckily I was able to capture everything while I was there to kind of like piece together different things if I was able to, but I still can't even give you an answer as to like what happened, because I'm getting all the information from you all. Because even though I do have all of his archived content, it's just, well, for me, for example, it's just really hard for me to come to a specific conclusion as to what his trigger point was.
Hi, I'm really interested in this public health de-radicalization aspect of it, and I spent some time listening to therapy sessions with family members of loved ones who have fallen into extremism, and I wonder, in your view, what is it that drives, I guess, mostly young men into these spaces, whatever ideology it might be, and what is it that brings people out? And relatedly, and I know it's a dicey piece of it, but it seems that a lot of extremists may also be on the spectrum and not undiagnosed. Where are we on all of this?
So we don't have perfect information on mental health, but our data set on terrorist perpetrators in the United States, again, it's about 2,200 individuals. And based on open sources, we don't have access to medical records unless they become a piece of evidence in a courtroom. But based on open sources, only 10% of the offender population has a known or suspected mental health issue. Now, that's a low number, meaning I think there's lots of cases where we don't have the information, so it's probably higher than 10%. It's not 50%, it's not 60%. It's a relatively low percentage of the offender population with a known or suspected mental health issue. But individuals who have a mental health issue and adopt an extremist worldview are, in our data, 1.4 times more likely to act out violently than the extremists right next to them. Does that make sense? So it's a risk factor for a violent outcome, but it isn't a predictor of who will embrace the ideology to begin with. Does that make sense? When you look at lone actors, however, it's a higher percentage, right? A much higher percentage of individuals with mental health issues. And that makes sense, right? Commonsensical approach. If you're a terrorist organization, you don't really want someone untrustworthy alongside of you because you're doing something dangerous and criminal. And so you might be less likely to partner with somebody who has a significant mental health issue. But a lone actor can find themselves in these online forums and then go act out independently. What are the risk factors associated with violent extremism, and what are the protective factors that help people get out? So the number one risk factor for a violent outcome so we don't have data about what drives people to embrace an extremist worldview. We don't. There's no real research there that is scientifically valid. There's a lot of anecdote and case study, which is valuable, but there's not a perfect scientific answer. But among criminal extremists, risk factors for a violent outcome versus a non-violent criminal outcome, criminal history is the number one most important risk factor. So individuals, it doesn't have to be an extremist-related crime. It doesn't have to be a violent crime. Someone with a criminal history is statistically much more likely to act out violently than an extremist right next to them without a criminal history. Things like mental health issues matter. Small group dynamics. So 3 dudes is dangerous. They groupthink themselves into spurring each other on to violence. So those are some of the risk factors. It's not all that helpful. What do you do with that information? All right, so criminal history, like that doesn't really narrow it down. You know what I mean? These are not particularly helpful in terms of saying who the next person is to engage in an act of extremist violence. They're fairly commonplace characteristics. Protective factors, things that help people get out of violent extremism after a criminal justice intervention. You won't be surprised. It's things like economic advancement, educational advancement, geographic change of location. Like if they move out of the town or where they have the friends who are, pulling them in one direction, they physically relocate to somewhere else. So there are some very basic, like pragmatic things that help people move on from extremism if they want to move on. And unfortunately, if you have a criminal record, it's often harder for you to get that economic advancement, educational advancement, a new social circle, right? Because we're not so good at embracing former terrorists, right? Politicians don't run for office and say, if you elect me, I'm going to spend your taxpayer money rehabilitating the terrorist next door, right? That's not a successful campaign promise, but it turns out it's really necessary if we want to de-risk that person after incarceration. We have to invest in rehabilitating and reintegrating them, but that costs resources, and people are often not so willing to spend it. So I wish I had like a really satisfying answer for you. I guess the overarching sentiment is that psychologists have studied individual terrorists for a long time and have not come up with any kind of psychological profile for who engages in terrorism. Terrorism is something that normal people embrace sometimes. It often comes on the back of a conspiracy theory, which sort of sucks people into a social environment in which that kind of violence is rewarded. And often there's some sort of need that is met at the individual level. But it is not necessarily that they're crazy. It's not a mental health issue necessarily. It might be that they just want empowerment, camaraderie, to feel important. And so when you add that up, it's a need of some kind, a network, and a narrative, right? That rewards certain behavior. But it's not something that is that. The word extremism is problematic. Right? We assume by extremism we mean those people are not like us. And that's not really accurate. Oftentimes terrorists will act out violently in support of the very same beliefs that other law-abiding citizens care deeply about. It's the behavior which is extreme. It's often not the beliefs. They often believe things that a larger percentage of the population believes. They just are willing to act out criminally and violently to advance it. So we have a real hard time in our minds sort of looking at someone and thinking, well, that person's not like me. Well, they actually might have just killed someone for something that you vote for, right? It's a hard thing for, I think, us to come to grips with.
No, it's alright. A really good article you should read is Martha Crenshaw, 1990. She's amazing. She goes into like rationality and terrorists are rational actors. And then another one on getting out of like movements and everything like that. Pete Simi, it's on Gang Exit, but it does a really good, it's Pete Simi 2010, and it's a really good look at how individuals will leave, gangs and everything, but the way that people do that is pretty much the same way people can de-radicalize from extremist ideologies. And I'm not saying that extremism is a gang, just putting that out there, because it's not. In a good movie, so I do a lot of reading and watching movies and everything like that. A good movie that shows how someone goes from radicalization to de-radicalization, American History X is a really good one, because you see how, like, in prison and everything like that, because there are prison gangs, like the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas and everything like that, which are really big, and you join those for protection, whatever it may be, in jail. And then when you get out, it's pretty much a matter of, are you going to stay within these movements and continue to embrace these ideologies, or are you going to go back to your normal life? So it's a really hard situation to come out of, but it is possible. There's not a lot of research on if people are actually de-radicalized, because just because I say, like, oh, I'm not violent anymore, whatever it may be, there's not a lot of data on, okay, how many successful cases actually are there of people saying they are actually de-radicalized at the point that they say they are? Is it just them talking, or is it actually true?
And most people who do choose to leave this behind, they leave it behind. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to be interviewed about it. Right. So the number of people who leave extremism is an unknowable number. We don't know how many people have left it behind, because they mostly just want to fade away. There's a small number who turn it into a kind of career. They serve as former extremists, and they might help other people get out of extremism. There's organizations that have a lot of formers as part of their cadre of people helping extract others from these movements. That's a minority of cases. There's very few people who want to sort of relive this, and but for some it's a kind of atonement. But they're not the typical case, and so if we look too much at them, I think we're probably, it's a selection bias issue, right? We're missing the majority, the silent majority.
Hi, Ashley Murray from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We had the 2018 synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. I was part of the team that covered that. And since then, we've had a pretty steady drumbeat of talks and warnings and, about Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania being, I think that the FBI recently warned it was a hotbed for far-right nationalist groups. And then last week we had a German anti-terrorism group set up their center in Pittsburgh, the Violence Prevention Network. So I'm wondering if in your work, do you see certain regions that are, so-called hotbeds? Is southwestern Pennsylvania one of those that you see if you are tracking regions? Or are there any other regions around the U.S.? I'm not asking just for my part of the state. I just am curious. When you're in local media, you kind of are in this world, and you. I want your wider take.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the work that you do. I know that was a really hard topic to cover then. Even, I think it was last year, 2019, the conference in Pittsburgh, there was
Eradicate hate.
Yeah, eradicate hate. I was there, and while I was there, I was monitoring things online. And while I was monitoring things online, I saw an article basically saying, "Hey, all the extremism researchers are in Pittsburgh right now. We can all get them all at once," like things like that. So it isn't necessarily region specific, I'd say, or state specific. You see some places that have more activity than others. Like, for example, the American Nazi Party, their headquarters was right in, Arlington, it used to be. So it's really close to home. And then if you're thinking, like, why Arlington out of all places in the world, if you look at, like, the history of, like, Virginia and Rockwell and everything like that, it makes sense. So a lot of the places that they will set up shop or attack, whatever it may be, do have some significance to them. Even like for Buffalo, for example, He went to where it was like the largest African American community in El Paso. He went to where it was the largest Latinx community. So it doesn't necessarily matter, go by state or whatever it may be. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes it may have some significance to that person. For Sandy Hook, there was a reason out of every school that he could have targeted, he chose Sandy Hook because he had some personal connection and things that like happened to him there. And realize I haven't said any of the perpetrators' names since being here, but they all have some specific connection to the place. But then you also have groups like the Proud Boys, where they are popular in other places and wherever else it may be. And I'm in a lot of Proud Boy platforms and conversations where I'm like monitoring, okay, this is what they're doing in Seattle. This is what they're doing in Virginia. Why are they doing something in Idaho? Like, why Idaho? So sometimes it is just localized things. Sometimes it has like a significance. So it pretty much varies, honestly. If there's like something big that's happening there, like the Eradicate Hate conference, you had all the extremism researchers and federal officials. You had pretty much everybody there that if you wanted to take them out, unfortunately, it would be a very big deal. And that'd be a lot of the extremism field. The people that are tracking them would just be gone.
So we looked at all the terrorist attacks in the United States in the global terrorism database, and used a criminological theory called hotspots theory, and tried to see, are there hotspots for terrorism like there are for crime, and if so, what are the characteristics at the county level of counties that experience more than their due of terrorist attacks. Turns out there are hotspots regarding terrorism in terms of attacks, which is different than like where people live and where they might radicalize, right? This is the attack. Again, not all that helpful. Turns out that larger populations have more terrorism. So cities, larger, so it makes sense, right? Terrorism is a human phenomenon. So the more humans there are, the more of that phenomenon you're going to see. When in terms of international terrorism, one might think that non-English speaking populations would matter. It turns out that that's not actually a correlation. You have places where many languages are spoken, right? Again, cities where there's more anonymity, there's a larger population, but for places that have large immigrant populations from one particular country, there's no correlation with increased, terrorism. So it turns out that there's not really a good set of risk factors for geography when it comes to terrorism. However, terrorism is a social phenomenon, right? It is the kind of thing that gets passed from person to person. So historically, I think there have been places that have been hotbeds for extremist thought. With the internet, that's becoming less important. And so it's one of those things where it's not a very helpful answer, but I don't think geography is particularly helpful currently in understanding this threat, although there are organizations that have headquarters or families that sort of carry the mantle on these things, and then in those specific instances, sure geography matters, but it's not the norm. It's not the primary.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Franklin with NPR. So I cover a lot of breaking news, whether that may be domestic news, international, you name it. Probably have wrote about it or when I'm here about it. So what are some best practices for us as reporters to have that conversation with our editors or our producers when it comes to writing headlines or even story ideas? Because oftentimes we may come up with one headline and then it goes to the copy desk and then it's a completely different thing and it's already out on social media and then boom, that's all she wrote. So what are some things that we can do to have those conversations or best practices as researchers to give that advice to start that in our newsroom, because you don't want to essentially get roasted online for things that this stuff that's under control.
Oh, you can start if you want.
I mean, it's a challenge, right? If it bleeds, it leads. There's an understandable dynamic about why more sensational headlines are attractive to producers and to organizations. We know from research that people are primed by the news that they consume, meaning that if you show people certain headlines or certain news articles and then give them a battery of questions about foreign policy or domestic policy, the news that they read before answering those questions will dictate the way that not dictate entirely, but will have a significant effect on how they respond. So I'll be less abstract. Coverage regarding Muslims in the United States has a direct impact on whether people think that we should have harsher immigration policies or more harsh foreign policy overseas in Muslim majority countries, right? So like the news matters. It literally primes people to think certain things are acceptable or not acceptable. That's a heavy responsibility. I don't know how you have that conversation other than to have a professional conversation saying, listen, there is research that shows that these headlines and the content of the way we cover the stories will impact society, right? I mean, but that's not new. You know that, right? And so do your producers. So the question is, how do you overcome that tendency in the moment? And I think you just have to try to be as sober about these particular topics as possible. Right? Terrorism is designed to get people to react emotionally. So be the antidote to that, right? Try to be the sober person in the room that doesn't take the bait, right? And that's a pretty useful way to frame it to a supervisor. Boss, don't be a sucker here. Don't be manipulated. They're trying to manipulate you right now. Right now. They're trying to manipulate you, but through that act of violence. Don't take the bait. But it's not an easy. People don't like to be manipulated, so I think that would be my strategy. But it's not an easy conversation to have.
I'm just gonna hop in as someone who's been on both sides of that. One way that you can kind of nip it in the bud is if you provide not just one headline, but like several headline options that you like, or if there's a word that you particularly want to stay away from, and emphasize that like it would be irresponsible to use a word like this or something like that. Another thing is if you know SEO, if you don't know SEO, learn it. If you do know SEO, make sure that your headline is already written with that in mind, because a lot of times when the copy desk is making those changes, it's for those sorts of reasons. So there are things that you can do proactively to like basically make sure that the headline that you choose makes it all the way through.
Yeah. Hi there. My name is Rachel Akors, and I work with Stat News. And I've been working more in kind of the misinformation space with COVID-19, and there's just been so much circulating in this space. And I think there's one specific misinformation campaign that I've been thinking about regarding a recent WHO meeting. So I think there's kind of a two-pronged question I have for you all. Is kind of our fact checks and kind of debunking a productive exercise in this space? And I think the second is how to responsibly cover kind of whether the government is prepared to deal with misinformation kind of around these events, just because, briefings and that sort of thing, I've just kind of gotten the sense from officials and what they've been telling us that they don't have like a strategy or anything to respond to this. And, you don't want to fault the response instead of kind of the people perpetrating it. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on kind of those two issues.
Yeah, in terms of COVID-19 and misinformation, Jigsaw, the parent company of Google, their Medium has a lot of things on misinformation and COVID-19. I actually have a lot of data on misinformation and COVID-19 because that was a really big topic and pretty much still is. And then in terms of the WHO, that's always going to be a big conspiracy theory because it is also at the same time very anti-Semitic, the way that they frame it and stuff online. So those both hand in hand are very big problematic issues that will continue to circulate online, unfortunately. I'm trying to think of the second part of your question.
Yeah, so it was kind of about the administration, and we were asking them what are you doing about this? And they're like, oh, we just put out a tweet thread and are just going to continue doing what we're doing. And to me, that just seemed insane, with these threats out there. So I'm just curious, if you've had conversations with government officials about that, whether that's an avenue for accountability for us to be raising questions about that.
I think that you see it all of the time because even with the shooting in Texas, you had everyone picking up on, oh, the shooter was trans, he was trans and all of it. And then you see this image of some random person from Reddit being considered the perpetrator of the shooting. And even, I don't remember who it was, but it was a senator who basically went on and tweeted like, oh my God, like the LGBTQ plus community was behind this attack, and making like his own like connections. There were no connections. This person was a random person who had nothing to do with the shooting, who was just on Reddit taking pictures of himself. So it just shows how fast misinformation can circulate. And then once that senator tweeted it, it was pretty much, oh, this is fact because this is coming from someone that we trust. So then it's like, now we must all believe that this was the perpetrator of the shooting. And I saw that one image, even after the person said, that isn't me, who conducted this attack, because I'm still posting pictures, I'm not dead. People were still circulating that image and saying like, oh, this is the shooter, this is the shooter, when it really wasn't. But it also just shows how quickly that people want to be the first to put something out, because it's a really good feeling. We all get like this little rush when we're the first person to like report on something or find something, but that also can contribute to misinformation if it isn't fact checked, if it isn't looked into either like before you put it out. Even though it might take some time, it's better to be promoting something that is fact checked and credible information compared to being the first to tweet something and it's very false, and you're putting someone else's life at risk. Right. An entire group.
And just to be clear, I was asking about like true or false. Right. Is this claim true? Not like the fact checking process. That's more like debunking, kind of like conspiracy theories. Yeah, PolitiFact, that kind of thing.
So look, it's very easy to be cynical and say that that doesn't work. That's not a silver bullet. Nothing is a silver bullet. I hate that kind of thinking, right? Like that's absurd. Yes, it matters. Of course, it's a really important tool, because there's a large percentage of our population that doesn't want to, they don't want to read garbage. They want to read factual information, right? And so if that fact check sort of stamp is there, it's helpful for people. Is it a silver bullet? Of course it's not a silver bullet. And the people that want to find, justification for their belief or their opinion, they're going to find it, right? So they're going to ignore the fact-checked article because they're going to find their source of authority somewhere else because they want to. But for the majority of the population, I think it's really helpful. In terms of government, DHS's CISA is the organization that is responsible for misdisinformation. The team there is very good, really dedicated, very smart people. But what a impossible job for a small government team to tackle, right? Like it actually, Kesa, I think, is right. It is our individual responsibility. There's this idea that somehow like we're not responsible for what we do online, like on social media, right? Like there's this idea that like, oh, I can retweet stuff. It doesn't, no, that actually matters. If you think about this from a policy standpoint, the DoD Counter-Extremism Activity Working Group was stood up over the past year after 6 January by the Secretary of Defense to look at extremism in the ranks. And one of their recommendations is to change DoD policy about what people in uniform do on social media. If they retweet extremist content, they are subject to disciplinary action. And there was a whole bunch of hot takes like, oh, that's garbage. The DoD is thought policing. Hell yeah, the DoD is thought policing. I was in the Army. Like, yeah, we have height and weight standards. We had standards about our facial hair. You don't think retweeting white supremacist content in an interracial organization matters? Like, these are behaviors. Like when we're online, we're behaving. It's not just speech, it's behavior. And the idea that we hold people accountable for it, I think, is really important. But it comes with, it has to be something that we decide we're individually responsible for. I think that's the only way this really improves. So that would be my recommendation to the government is foster that sense of individual responsibility, because the government can't stop it. They're not you. So they don't create the content, and they're not me receiving the content. So it's up to us.
I'm Mark Walker with the New York Times. Just kind of want to ask and see what factor does race play in sort of seems like the country's inability to shift towards addressing domestic terrorism. It seems like, when you look back, it's sort of like even the origin of some sort of, some anti-government far right groups dating back to the Oklahoma bombing Like there seemed like kind of a resistance to really put resources towards tackling and addressing that. And we see kind of where that's gotten us today. But when you look at sort of the rise of sort of like Black Lives Matter and like the response from law enforcement and DHS, it seems like race does sort of play a factor into how they shift their resources, how much resources they allocate to domestic terrorism. I want to kind of get your guys' perspective of like what role that plays in it and why it seems like there's such a resistance to making that shift overall.
I'd say that race is a very big issue, unfortunately, when it does come to these issues, because you can even see even the localized response to a lot of these issues. Unfortunately, in Buffalo, they took the perpetrator away, even though he had killed all these people, just in handcuffs. But if you look at the history of the Buffalo Police Department, they've killed unarmed people, even someone who, none of these people had weapons or anything on them. They just felt threatened, unfortunately. That just shows like the localized response. But then also we don't have a definition when it comes to terrorism and even domestic terrorism, and every organization has their has different definitions, which does make it often difficult. But race does unfortunately have a factor into this, because America, I will say, it was built on white supremacy. The Klan has a long history of being in America. We've had presidents who have ultimately been a part of the Klan. So it's just a part of our history, but then also just within America with domestic terrorism as a whole, you have the Second Amendment and the First Amendment and everything like that. So people they have rights. So that's why we have to respond to domestic issues different than we respond to foreign issues, because we can't just say, oh, let's nuke the far right, or I don't know, let's use drones, because those aren't the proper response to the issues that we do have today. But we also don't want to politicize these issues at the same time, because it can contribute to polarization, which is a very big thing that we are living in right now. But hopefully in the future we will get better with these issues. There's always some hope. I mean, we're in 2022, but if you look back in history, nothing has changed even up to 2022. But I think we can do better if we continue like having these conversations, especially around gun violence and everything like that. Even though we have mass shootings happening in Buffalo, we still have people, say like in Chicago, for example, or Newark, New Jersey, who are still losing their lives, but we don't necessarily report on it. And you don't hear about it because people are like, oh, well, in Chicago, they have gang wars and people are dying every day. We don't need to report on it. But it is something that we do need to be like more mindful of, because although we don't know the victims of those shootings, we still do have to honor their lives. And we can't just talk about when big things happen, because you never know like what could be next. And even in May alone, we had 40 mass shootings, and nobody has talked about it. We don't think about it. And there's probably more shootings than we even know about that weren't reported on that happened in the month of May. But definitely think that race is a big factor, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I'm like absolutely ashamed that it was probably less than 2 years ago when I first really thought about hate crime. I'm a terrorism researcher. I've been doing this for 15 plus years. Think about that, right? That's kind of structural racism. I was immersed in ideologically motivated violence and completely ignorant and blind to hate crime until my research team, one of my teams, put together, think about this, the first data set in the United States on perpetrators of hate crime. This was like 2 years ago. That's insane, right? It's insane. But I was totally blind to a phenomenon that happens at orders of magnitude more frequently than terrorism in the United States. That kind of structural racism, like you don't even see it, right? I didn't even see it. And now that this data set exists, and I don't mean to overstate this, but we started, I just went on a mission to this data. I just went to the US government and every office I could talk to and say, listen, we have to start allocating resources rationally based on the actual threat of ideologically motivated violence. And the overwhelming source of ideologically motivated violence in the United States is white supremacist violence. Yes, it's the majority of terrorist attacks in the United States. It is 90% of the hate crime. And the hate crime, right, this happens at thousands and thousands of attacks a year. So we for example, talked to the DoD's Counter-Extremism Activity Working Group. And in their December report, they said that they're going to use our hate crime data going forward to inform the DoD's internal policy on extremism in the ranks. That's a small little step in the right direction. But you first have to make the information public, right? There are good people in government that want to do the right thing, but they make decisions, they allocate resources based on information, ideally, and often. If the information's not there, they can't make that decision, right? There's nothing to base it on. So just providing this data set changed the DoD's policy. It also changed the way the FBI, DHS, and CTC reported to Congress. Last year, they released a report, and we advocated really strongly that they include hate crime in this report to Congress about the state of domestic terrorism. Don't just limit it to terrorism, include hate crime, and they did. So I feel like we're kind of waking up a little bit and we're pushing in the right direction, but we have such blinders on that we don't even, I'll speak for myself, such a blinder on that I didn't even see it. And it's embarrassing, right? But it is honest.
And even going off of that point really quick, even before everything like happened to me at American University with like the bananas and everything, I didn't think that hate crime still like happened. I don't know, like today, like I don't know if I was like in my own little bubble. I thought it was just something that my grandparents would tell me about, like from like the civil rights era and everything like that. But it was that situation alone that showed like it can happen to anybody. Like who's paying attention to little American University in DC just because Taylor wanted to become the first Black female president? Like who was thinking of that? But I didn't think that was one of those things that could happen to like little old me. But then from that moment on, I realized that it can happen to anybody. And I wanted to take like my experience and like learn to think like them and just learn like everything that I can, which made me want to be a researcher today to ensure that like that never happens to somebody else.
Sunny Efren from NPF. In light of what you've said, we obviously the Second Amendment's in the news right now. You're speaking to people who focus more on the First Amendment, and we tend to be radical First Amendment people, our bias. In light of everything that you've learned in the last year, what are your views on two specific issues? One is incitement, and the second is Section 230 that are in the news. There was a debate, obviously, after January 6th on whether the incitement laws were appropriate, whether they were properly worded. Would you support or advocate for any kind of reform of incitement law? And same with Section 230, which is also obviously hotly debated right now in Congress. In light of what we now know about white supremacy and all that, what is your view of Section 230, and does it need reform, and if so, how? Thank you.
Those are my favorite words. That's why I smiled when you said that. And the simple answer is yes. Both of those do need to be revised, and I'm pretty sure all the tech companies are tired of me saying it. Even as a member of one of the GIFCT working groups, I'm constantly telling them there's a problem on your platform. I'm going to say it. You have a problem, and you need to fix it. But there definitely are ways to reform Section 230 without infringing on the First Amendment. It's just a matter of actually doing it, because it is possible. And then in terms of incitement, we do see it all the time, but then also, which was previously stated about like threats and everything, it is really hard because different platforms and everywhere have like different terms of service and policies and everything like that. So what might be acceptable on Gab is not acceptable on Twitter. and just so far down the line. So it is really hard to change that one in itself because of the different varying terms of service and policies. But Section 230 definitely. And in terms of like the incitement, I think that platforms would have to change their terms of service and policies, which can take time. So I think that would be something that can be done like more like in the long term. But Section 230 can definitely be fixed more like in the short term, but not like in a week or in a month or anything like that. But I'd say definitely in the short term.
I think I'm skeptical of the ability of government to regulate the tech world because it's moving so fast, so quickly, and it changes. And by the time you sort of understand what it is today, it's different because there's a pipeline of capability that's just constantly being developed. So I just don't know that regulation has the ability to keep up. There's in military history, there's something called the gun armor race. And the idea is that if you're building a battleship or a tank and you try to increase the armor to stop the most advanced weapon that's going to try to attack you, you wind up spending 3 times as much as the person who's developing the next firearm or the next, right? So it's a losing battle. The gun armor race is a losing battle for the one who's playing defense. It's always easier to be on the offense. It's always cheaper. And you think about sort of tech companies and their attempts to try to prevent extremism online. Facebook went through iterations where they decided they were going to take QAnon on. QAnon, any content that was QAnon related that talked about violence, they said they're going to take it offline. That was a big step for them. And what happened is QAnon just went more mainstream because they stopped talking about violence explicitly and they started talking about yoga and Save the Children and cooking and all these other things. So it actually just accelerated the spread of the QAnon conspiracy by defanging it. It went into more places. And so I think it's a really difficult thing to think that we're going to pass a law that's going to sort of make a significant dent in this. I think it's more about individual level behaviors and influence as opposed to top-down approaches.
Thank you guys for being here. I had a separate question, but your answer just gave me, I think, a better question. It was a little bit of depressing of an answer too, in terms of Congress and policymakers maybe never being able to catch the car in terms of regulating the space. Does that mean that is it all? I guess if that's something that's not possible, and if policy is always going to move slower, I guess in your view, than technology, does that mean that it's sort of impossible to kind of put the toothpaste back in the tube in terms of how people radicalize on the internet and social media?
So I had a conversation with a company in the GIF-CT environment, and the person representing this company kept talking about them, extremists. And I said, stop talking about them. You're developing the platform. It's your technology. Like, you're the adversary. It's your engineers. It's your, right? Like, if you don't take personal responsibility for the fact that you're creating dual-use technology that can be used for good or for ill, right? Stop talking about them. Are you talking to your engineers? Are you engineering out vulnerabilities to exploitation? And if you're not engineering out those vulnerabilities to be exploited, you're going to be exploited. It's up to I think it's going to take that kind of an attitude in order to really make significant change. But what do people want when they go online? Well, they want privacy. And so what are the companies going to deliver? Privacy. Well, that means encrypted end-to-end communications. You can pass all the rules you want. If the company can't see what's going through its own pipes, well, right? Like, Telegram doesn't know what you say on Telegram. They don't know. They don't see it. It's encrypted. Only you see it and the person who receives it. So again, it's going to take individual level behavior change. It's going to take organizations to try to be as responsible as possible as they engineer these solutions. But the direction of travel is such that end-to-end encryption and decentralized internet means that there's nothing,
Ship has sailed in some sense.
I think this is a part of our reality, right?
Yeah. I'd say that de-radicalization, not deplatforming, even if they move off of one platform, they're going to go to another. When people were banned from Twitter during like that massive Twitter wave, they went to Gab. It's really hard to get suspended from Gab. It's really hard. I've seen probably 1 or 2 people be suspended from Gab, which means they were doing some really, really bad stuff. Because I've seen really bad stuff on there and it's never taken down. But even if we do revise a lot of like these policies and everything like that, which it is possible, they're just going to go further underground. So the more they go further underground, the harder it is to find them. So it's a win-lose situation because they are away from the people we want to protect, like the kids or whoever may be easily radicalized. But then they just go deeper underground and can be saying whatever they want to be saying. And we don't know necessarily what it is unless you have like the right people, researchers in those areas. But they can just create their own websites, like the creation of Stormfront, the world's first hate site, was created in response to other social media platforms. So if you kick me off one place, I'm going to go to another place. And then I'm also going to be on another place. But then even if I'm on Twitter, I'm going to plant my seeds on Gab, 4chan, whatever it may be, in the event I am suspended or whatever it may be from Twitter. So it's like a game. It's a game of leapfrog. And I don't know. I like the game. Following them across platforms, I think it is definitely an interesting field to be studying, like extremism, because it's constantly changing. I know if I go online today, it's going to be something different than I saw yesterday. So it's always something new, and that's what keeps it unfortunately interesting. But then having to stay on top of those trends because it is always something different. So just being aware of everything that's happening online.
If I just one request. So I, as part of my job with We the Veterans, I volunteer with this veterans organization. I participate in something called the Democracy Communicators Collaborative, and it's run in part by an organization called More in Common. And they did this really interesting survey where they surveyed Republicans and Democrats and asked them what they thought the other said about a battery of questions. And then they had everybody answer those battery of questions themselves. And it turns out that both parties assume the worst of the other, but all the respondents were actually had way more in common, right? We're way closer to one another, and much more, very much in support of democracy, peaceful transfer of power, free press. American values were still there. It's just that we don't think they're there. So please tell the story, right? That is there in the middle. Because if no one tells the story about the middle, which is the majority, it becomes invisible, and we only see the extremes. And that's really dangerous in a two-party democracy, right? And I think it's where we are. I think we're at a very dangerous moment. And we need people to tell the story in the middle with as much passion as we tell the story on the polar extremes. So I would ask you to help.
Thank you both. It's definitely frightening and complicated, but it's one of the most important topics that we can cover. And please follow Kesa's advice. Make friends, or at least reach out to researchers so that you're well prepared to cover these issues. And thank you both for your time and expertise today.